back, everybody. In today's video, I'm going to be doing a massive project on the 2.5. So last video, I showed you that I was running 35s and I put a slight lift kit in the rear, but now it's time to actually turn those 35s. Fitting them is one thing, getting them to turn is another. So today I'm going to be doing a front and rear diff swap, and I'm going to be adding an e-locker to the front diff. So this is a pretty massive job and there are tons of advantages, but I'm gonna save all of that till the end of the video. I'm gonna go over what the advantages are as far as your speed on the highway, your RPM for rock crawling. I'm also gonna talk about the cost benefit analysis of all of this. But first, I'm just gonna jump in. We're gonna get started on this job. This is a pretty massive job. You've got to disassemble most of the front end and you've got to pull the rear third member out. So let me get this up in the air and show you guys exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about removing the differentials. All right, car's up in the air and let's talk front and rear differentials. Now we'll have to pull off this skid plate to get at the front one, but you can see it right in there. We're gonna pull that guy out, and then here's your rear differential, and we're actually just gonna remove this third member. Now, the reason we're doing this is because these diffs are the 4.272, which is also known as 4.3. So that means for every 4.3 rotations of this drive shaft, you get one rotation at the wheel. And we want to have a further reduction because we're running bigger tires, because we want this thing to crawl up rocks. We're going to be going from a 4.3 to a 4.9. I'll show you those differentials here in a little bit. There they are right there. I'll show you what we're switching to, the differences, and talk about where I got them from. But that's the big thing we're doing here. So because it's a little simpler, I'm going to start on the rear end here. This is going to involve pulling the axle shafts out at least a little ways, disconnecting a pinion right here from the rear of the drive shaft. And so in order to get started there, we're going to go ahead and we're going to drain this fluid. So let's get to draining this diff, and I'll show you guys how to pull these axle shafts so that you can pull that third member. Okay, so here's that fluid. Oh my. That is, it's not great. It obviously has not been changed in a while. However, there doesn't seem to be any water in there, so that's good. Here's what that drain bolt's looking like. There's definitely some flex. Yeah, that'll be interesting when we get in there, see the condition of the locker. Like I said, we're not gonna be reusing these gears. However, we are gonna be reusing this housing because it has provisions for the locker, the air locker line, and the sensor, and we're gonna wanna retain that. So, I'm gonna let this drain for a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and take these bolts off first and get this drive shaft out of the way. There's gonna be a 14 on this side and a 17 on this side. This is easier if the vehicle is in neutral. You can kind of spin this around. Mine is not, so I'm gonna have to struggle a little bit with the bolts up there. But either way, I'm gonna get this off and then we'll move on to the axle shafts. So we've made some progress. I got the drive shaft taken off and I've just kind of hung it up here with some twisty wire to tuck it away. It doesn't need to be super out of the way, but we have to pull this differential out this direction. So got that taken care of. I also went around and I took off all of these bolts and nuts. These are 14s. So I got all of those taken care of, as well as the diff lock sensor right here. I did break this tab. You probably will too, getting it off of there. So that'll be something that I have to zip tie later or secure in some way. The rest of that can just stay on the housing. And then the last thing I removed is gonna be this air line that goes to the top of the air locker. At this point, we're almost ready to pull this. However, there are two axle shafts that come in from each side that are in this third member. So I need to disconnect those. In order to do that, it's going to be pretty simple. There's 4 nuts on the back here, and hopefully, fingers crossed, they come out pretty easily, and then I'll be able to drive that axle shaft and this hub face out this direction. Now, this is a little bit of a tricky process. You don't need to remove too much. However, I am gonna remove this ABS line right here that holds the parking brake, as well as this bracket right here. And you can actually stretch the brake lines to the point where you can get this third member out. You can slide these out far enough, so you don't need to disconnect the brakes. If you're nervous about it, or if your stuff is really rusty, you might want to, but mine are looking okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna get the bolts taken off on that side and this side, get those ABS sensor wires disconnected, and then I'm gonna start easing that out, and I'll show you guys how to break this free and pull this third member out. So the bolts are out and I've got the axle shafts kind of hanging here. So the way that I got this out is you take those out right there, and then I hit with a hammer ever so slightly right here. Now you got to negotiate with it. You got to push it out of this axle housing face, but you don't want to be wailing on it. But right here, this is a structural part of this hub face, and so it allows it to push out, and then it's going to rotate and clock this direction. Now here's what I'm talking about with those lines. Here's your parking brake. You can see that's pretty taut right now. And it turns out I actually didn't have to disconnect the ABS sensor, but you do have to pull this so you can get at this bracket because the ABS sensor is gonna stay there. There's that tone ring for the ABS sensor. And then around here, you can see where that brake line is getting stretched. Now, do this at your own risk. Again, I don't know your braking system, so you might have a much more fragile line than me. This one, like I said, is in good condition, so I'm able to stretch it and it'll bend back just fine. I'm gonna have to undo this side right here, this 12, and allow it to stretch a little more. However, on this side, I didn't have to do that, and I went ahead and pulled it out, and I've got enough flex. I can feel this axle shaft is loose in there. So same exact thing on this side. I just have to pull this out, and then we're gonna get to tackling this. With all of the bolts out, you gotta break the seal on this guy. And if this has never been taken apart, which it probably hasn't, it's gonna be crusty. So it's gonna take a little bit of work with a pry bar, either against the sway bar or somehow wedging it in here against the axle, maybe if you can kind of pry in there, or you're gonna have to hit it with a hammer. If you're gonna hit it with a hammer, just be careful. If you crack this housing, you are in a bad spot. So maybe put a block of wood in between, but you're definitely going to have to pop that seal with that silicone. Make sure all the bolts are undone, and then put one nut. I like to put one right here on the top, about half threads. That allows it to still break the seal, but the differential won't kind of pop out and fall on the ground on you. You don't want that. That would obviously be really bad. So I'm gonna get to disconnecting that, pull that aside, and then I'm gonna break this loose and get this third member pulled out. Oh yeah, there it is. Sweet. All right, so I'm wheeling this back and forth, and I can feel that it doesn't quite want to come out, and that's because it's still stuck on the axle shaft over here. So I need to pull that further out to free up this third member. There it is. You can kind of feel it. Has a distinct movement to it. I want to work this guy out. The pry bar is very helpful for this. Make sure all your bolts are out. This thing's gonna be very heavy when it decides to come out. So be careful of where your fingers end up. And I like to pull it out, and I'm gonna rest it right here on the sway bar. And then I'm gonna grab it, rotate it up like this, oh, and pull the whole thing down. So there's the rear diff out. Now we'll take a closer look at this and why this housing is really important, what to do with it once we get both diffs side by side. But I wanted to just show you this, get a lay of the land. So here's those axle shafts I was talking about, and here's kind of a windage tray of sorts that goes on either side. And you're gonna see there is gonna be a bunch of diff fluid that just hangs out there. It sits below the drain plug. So if you want to right now, you can clean all that up with like a rag or something. It's gonna make an absolute mess. Also worth noting, you'll lose some diff fluid out of the sides when you pull the axle shafts out. So just be aware of that. It shouldn't be a ton if you drain this. However, there's gear oil flowing back and forth in here. So I've gone ahead and I've slid these back in so that they're just not hanging by the brake line or anything else. That's obviously not good for it. So I've got the studs just resting in there. I'm not gonna bolt it up. There wouldn't be any point in that. But I got those back in there, and now it's time to move on to the front. So I've got this one out. Now we're gonna move on to the front. The front is a totally different and way more complicated process, but we're gonna get that unloaded so that we can have all of this stuff side by side and work on it on the bench. And moving on to the front, I went ahead and pulled that skid plate off, and this one's gonna be a lot more complicated because in the back you removed what's called the third member. So it's gonna be that center section, and this one, you don't have the same kind of third member. Instead, the differential is actually attached to this entire carrier. So we're gonna have to remove both CV shafts, which involves disassembling pretty much the entire knuckle on both sides, the front drive shaft, as well as some vacuum lines, and then we're gonna have to disconnect these bushings right here and pull this entire thing out and work on it on the bench once it's out. So the first part is very similar to the rear diff. You're gonna wanna drain the fluid. Again, gives you a good chance to see how it looks. This stuff looks a little cleaner. Not nearly as much crud on the magnet, which makes sense. It's a front diff, so it's gonna have a lot less going on as far as the load, and it's gonna be running two-wheel drive most of the time, so this isn't, like I said, gonna be loaded that much. But we're gonna let that drain, and as we let it drain, we're gonna start working on the CVs. So if you've never pulled CVs on a Gen 2, they are significantly harder than some of the more modern cars. Now that being said, it's still fairly easy, but it's gonna require a lot more stuff to come off. So once I get this lower down, I'll go ahead and show you exactly what needs to come off for you to pull this CV shaft. On the other side, the process is very similar, but you have to remove these nuts from this intermediate shaft. And so you've got to come in here, and this is just like a drive shaft. You've got to remove those so that you can pull that CV shaft out. But let's get this thing drained out. Let's get this lowered down, and we'll start disassembling this hub. So as mentioned, quite a few things need to come off over here. Basically, we're going to pull this whole knuckle assembly off of the vehicle. That's the easiest way to get the CV out. And I'm gonna go ahead and try to take as few parts off as possible, as safely as possible. So we're gonna start here right at the hub face. We're gonna go ahead and pull this cap, and we're gonna pull these 14mm bolts. There's two things we need to get off here. The first one is we need to get the ring, the snap ring behind this, and then we need to actually pull this face off so that the CV axle can slide back. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna pop off this cap, and you just get a pry bar in there and you can pry against these bolts. And the reason we want to do that is there's a snap ring right here. So there's that snap ring, and you can see it goes right into the end of the CV shaft. So in order for this to go backwards, you've got to remove that. And then I actually just saw it in the camera. There's also going to be this little washer. Now keep track of those. You want to make sure that you put that back on, because that's going to set the depth of where this can stick out. So it's a little shim. Honestly, I have not seen it cause that many issues if you leave it out. I ran one without it for a long time, but better to keep it if you can. So get some snap ring pliers in there, pull that guy off, pull that little shim out, and set it aside. So with the snap ring removed, you can see this guy is gonna move in and out. You shouldn't have to remove this hub face or the rotor, so you should be good there. That's all that needs to happen over here. The next one's gonna be upper and lower ball joints, as well as this tie rod end. So you got this guy right there. You're gonna have a cotter pin, that's gonna be a 22. Then you got this one right here with a cotter pin, that's gonna be a 19. And then you've got this one down here, and that's gonna have a cotter pin, and it's a 24. So you need to pull all of those out. And then once those are all out, you're gonna need to disconnect this ABS line. That way you can pull the whole entire thing off. On this side, the stuff that needs to come out, that's gonna be this brake caliper. Now you don't have to pull the actual brake caliper bracket off, you just need to pull the caliper off. So these are going to be 14mm bolts. No, sorry. These are going to be 17mm bolts, and I'm just gonna zip tie this up out of the way. It's gonna be out of the way for a while, and I wanna make sure that it doesn't fall and jolt and put stress on this line. So I'm gonna get that taken off, gonna get those ball joints taken apart, and I'll show you how to break all that apart safely so that you can drop this knuckle down and out. So we got all that stuff disconnected, aside from this ABS sensor, which I'm gonna tackle in a second. But I got to the point where things are gonna get sketchy. So here's what I mean. This entire system is loaded by the torsion bar. What's happening right now is there's torque that's going onto the lower control arm, which is pulling the whole system down, and that is limited by these bump stops on the upper control arm. So as you start to separate this, things are going to want to move, and depending on how you have it supported, they're going to move very quickly and violently. So you gotta be really safe. Now, if you watched my last video about doing a lift kit, then you know about the torsion bars and how to adjust them. And it is possible that I'm going to have to completely undo all of that to get this torsion bar to calm down so that I can actually get this arm back. However, right now I'm not super concerned about this. I just want to pull this thing out. So I've got my transmission jack. You could do this with a floor jack if you're on the ground, supporting the lower control arm right here. And I'm going to slowly start to work out this 22mm nut that's on this upper ball joint. I'm going to leave this one, which is it's loose right now, but there's a little bit of space, but I'm making sure it has full thread engagement just in case for some reason this wants to fall out, this whole hub would fall out. And I'm not ready for that yet. Not only do I not want it to fall on the ground, but I still have to disconnect this ABS sensor. So I'm gonna very slowly work this out. I'm gonna try to catch it on camera, what happens when you release the tension from that nut. Okay, I'm using my electronic ratchet. There you go. So when you do it safely, that's what it's gonna look like. And then this upper control arm is going to be free. However, remember, the lower control arm is still loaded. So again, here's that lower control arm loaded. I'm going to start to let it down with the transmission jack here. Okay, so now everything's unloaded. That was nice and safe. Sometimes I think these bushings are a little more worn out than, yeah, they shouldn't really be able to move like that. They should be able to be locked in one spot. And so what you can do is you can come in here. I think these are 22 millimeter nuts, and you can loosen those up and allow it to flex. You'll have to set them back up. These actually, I don't know if these are OEM or not. I mean, they're solid bushings. They're just maybe not quite as spring loaded as they should be. Or they're not attached. But either way, it doesn't matter. It's actually helpful in this case. Now you can see here, there's some tension on this ABS sensor. I've been trying to work this thing out of here. I just can't get it out. So I'm gonna go up into the engine bay and I'm gonna disconnect it from there and I'm gonna pull the whole thing out. At this point, we're pretty close to being able to pull the whole knuckle out. And you can see the CV shaft is starting to come out a little bit. That's perfect. You actually can't take this out without removing the whole knuckle, which is so frustrating and important. So we do have to disconnect it down here at this ball joint. But let me get this tension off of this ABS line. So if you're unfortunate like me and you can't get that thing out of the hub, this is the ABS sensor wire right here. It's right next to the battery. And then it's almost impossible to film, but there's a little clip down there that I had to cut. It's that white one right there. That guy right there holds it in. It's very annoying. Hopefully you can get yours out a little easier, but that's what I did. So now I've got this all disconnected. It's time to move on to this lower ball joint. We're gonna spin this off so that it's almost about to fall off. And then you can either use a ball joint separator or you can just smack this with a hammer to have this separate, shock load it, fall down, and then we'll be able to unwind that all the way and pull this whole hub assembly off. There it goes. Now it's worth noting, I prefer that method because it really preserves the ball joint boots. So that's why I do it that way. There's that nut, set it aside. Then we should be able to drop this down and in one fell swoop, take the whole thing off. There's your knuckle. Another important thing to note here is a washer that goes on the inside of the CV shaft. So this goes between the body of the CV and the back of that hub. And in case you're wondering, this is the orientation. It's got grooves like this that go towards the diff. So remember that. Set this aside for later. Now it's time to pull this CV shaft out. Now I won't lie to you guys, this CV shaft is a pain. You can see right there where it goes into the actual diff, and there just isn't a lip to get this out. It's held in by this bracket, and this bracket isn't easy to remove. So you gotta really hope that this comes out. Now, you might have noticed that this CV is damaged, so I'm not super worried about keeping it really nice. Like the boot might have to get torn up, but the best way to get it out is to just give it one good pop and boom. Oh, I got so lucky. That's how you get it out. Just one big jerking motion. You can see it's got a snap ring right there. That's what's holding it in. Wow, that was so lucky. This side is out. Now onto the passenger side. This side is exactly the same process. You follow all the same steps. You want to keep track of all the same things with the exception of those bolts right there. But that's the very last step you do. So I'm going to get this thing all the way torn down just like I did before. And then I'll show you how to do that last step. And after an equal amount of struggle, I have this knuckle taken off and I did have to disconnect the ABS sensor. It's going to be real hard to see, but the sensor goes right here. So you got to pull that whole thing off if it doesn't come off. And now it's time to take these bolts off. And these work just like a drive shaft. So you're gonna have a 14 on this side and a 14 on this side. And you can either take this off with an impact or a wrench or whatever, but you gotta hold this other side. You're gonna disconnect all four of those and then you'll be able to pull this CV shaft out. So those bolts are taken out, or rather those nuts, and you're gonna leave these bolts in here. They're gonna stay on the secondary shaft and they're just gonna stay with the carrier. Now it's time to pull the carrier. We're finally at the point where this thing can come out. And there's gonna be 3 mounts. There's gonna be a mount here on the back, and those are gonna be 17s on each side. This is a captured or welded nut, so you just need to pull off this side. That's a 17. This is a 17, same situation over here. There's a bushing and a captured nut on the other side. And then right here, you're gonna have the same setup. So it's pretty easy to do, but you also need to pull this cross member. These are all gonna be 19 millimeter bolts. There's gonna be nuts on this side and bolts on this side, and you're gonna have to pull all of those out to drop this down. Now, I'm not 100% sure if the order matters, but I'm gonna go ahead and leave this and this mount, these front mounts in, and I'm gonna focus on pulling out this cross member. I'm gonna start with disconnecting right here, then I'm gonna work with a wrench and my impact and pull these bolts out of this cross member so that I can eventually drop the whole thing down. Now, before we pull the front diff carrier out, we also need to undo this side of the drive shaft. So we got a 12 on this side and a 14 on this side. It's exactly the same as the rear. Just wanna zip those off, tuck this out of the way, and then we'll have this side disconnected and we can get to disconnecting and pulling out the main carrier. Drive shaft disconnected out of the way. I've got this freed up. Time to move on to the rest of the carrier. So I've got this top mount disconnected and these 4 bolts, and you gotta kind of pound these out. They don't wanna come out. Putting them in is actually a little bit harder than taking them out, especially if you're not 100% lined up. So this diff is going to sit right here on this part of the cross member. So it's not going to fall down on you. You don't have to worry about that. However, as you can see right here, as this comes out, you're gonna run into your first of, I believe, 3 vacuum lines. So it might be 2 vacuum lines actually. Well, we'll find out. Okay, so this one right here is to a vacuum holder, a storage tank, and you got it right there. And just for reference, if you're wondering where this line goes, that's it right there. So it comes off the bottom of this and goes right to this tank. So I'm gonna disconnect this at the tank and I'm gonna pull this whole cross member out. And we're at the final stages here. I have disconnected the front. Again, those are captured nuts. So those are gonna come out pretty easy. And as you can see here, I've got it supported. Now you can do this with a jack stand. I'm doing it with the transmission jack. And this is a little sketchy. This thing weighs quite a bit and you kind of have to shimmy and shake it down because it's gotta come this way to clear this cross member and then it's gotta come out. Let's talk about vacuum lines and this electrical connector. Or this sensor right here tells the ECU when the diff is in 4-wheel drive. So you're gonna have to disconnect that. And you're gonna have to disconnect these vacuum lines, otherwise they're gonna get stretched. For reference, here's what those vacuum lines look like when they're hooked up. This one right here goes up to this line right there. You can see it is just covered in oil. This one on the front of that actuator comes up and sneaks behind to that one right in the middle. And then this one goes down low. I believe that this one's actually some sort of breather. It kind of loops around the front. So these 2 right here are for the actuator for the diff. This one's gonna be your breather. And then that 4th one, or this one right here, that's gonna be for your vacuum canister. So you're gonna wanna disconnect those. I prefer to disconnect them at the actual assembly. I find it just makes it a little easier to reattach them. That way you don't get to mix them up over here. And then you have to disconnect this electrical connection right here. And that guy is gonna snake around the front here and it's gonna go up into this wiring harness and drop down on this side. And you can see right here, there's gonna be this middle plug. Now we already disconnected this for the ABS. So you just wanna disconnect this guy and then you're gonna have to pull it off of the body side of the car. So disconnect that right here, make sure it's out of all of these clips. I believe this one is bolted in. Yep, I can sneak you back there. That one's gonna be bolted in, so you have to remove that. And then this one is also going to be attached to the frame. However, that one is plastic. Oh wait, hold on. That one is actually attached to the diff carrier, so that one can come with it. But this one up here has gotta come off. There's no way to take it off without removing that, what looks like to be a 12 millimeter bolt. So get this disconnected from here, 12 millimeter bolt off. These vacuum lines come off and then you're ready to shake this thing out of here. Okay, all the lines are disconnected. It's time to see if I can shake this thing out. You gotta be very careful with this. It is extremely heavy and pretty awkward. So I'm gonna let it down a little bit at a time, let it kind of slide over Make sure everything is clear. It's got to clear this front mount, and so it's going to get hung up a little bit. Let it down. You got to pull it. Okay, there it is. That's free. Come on, coming down. Oh yeah, okay. Oh no. Okay. All right, so I got it rested on the steering arm, get it up and over that, and then all the way down. All right, there's the diff pulled. Holy crap. Phew! All right. Oh, yes. 50% of the way there. All right, so we have both of the rear differentials out and both of the front differentials out. And I'm gonna start with the rear. And I want to address a few things as we go through this. So I'm going to be reusing the housing that came in this 1998 Montero because it has fittings for the air. And the air needs to activate the locker, and then it's also got a sensor, which is not strictly necessary, but it's nice to have. And if I didn't have that, I would have to drill a hole in this, which it does have a flat spot, but also I believe that these castings are actually different. You can see that there's a bolt hole for this one, and there's not a place to put a bolt in there. And so the easier thing to do is to just keep this housing. However, these are the 4.3 gears and these are the 4.9 gears. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm going to transfer the gears from here onto this carrier. So I'm gonna reuse the locker, I'm gonna reuse the housing, but I'm gonna move the gears from over here to this housing. So the first step is to tear this down and see what we're working with in the 4.9 gear set. So I've skipped ahead here a little bit to show you guys what this looks like completely blown apart. And I will show you, just so you have an idea of kind of the layout of the diff, what this looks like as you pull it down. But I want to talk about the 4.9 gears. So the ratio between the pinion and the ring gear here is 4.9 to 1. So every 4.9 times that this turns around, this whole apparatus, which turns your tires and your wheels at your hub, that moves this moves one time for every 4.9 that this goes. Now, if this is all seeming pretty overwhelming to you, I don't blame you. I'm also overwhelmed. I have to relearn all this stuff. I've got a bunch of friends who can help me out with it, so I'm gonna try to tackle most of it by myself. However, if you didn't want to mess with any of this, this is the time where you take this and this and this to your local diff shop, someone you trust, and say, I need these gears to go in this housing, and they should be able to take care of it for you. They're gonna set the pinion depth, they're gonna set things like the resistance here on this flange, they're gonna set the backlash, make sure the gears are right, and that's honestly the best way to do it. It's expensive, but you're already providing the gears, and as long as you've got a shop that's comfortable doing this, they should be able to transfer it over. That's what I would recommend for pretty much anyone. However, I'm going to tackle this myself. I'm gonna get in here. I have done one before. I've done 2 or 3 before. I know how to get far enough. And for those of you who are just curious, I wanna dive into this. So now that I've got this torn down, I need to make sure that all of this is labeled and set aside. I don't wanna be mixing up end caps, bearings, anything like that. So I'm gonna put all of this stuff for the 4.9 aside, and I'm gonna start tearing down this locker unit. It's gonna be a little different because you've got your diaphragm, your locker, and you've got these lines. And so it's really good to get a good lay of the land of how everything is set up on this before you take it apart. So I'm gonna get in here, I'm gonna start pulling all this off and show you guys exactly what it looks like to break one of these down. So the first step is gonna be coming in here and removing all of the things for the airlines. You wanna be really careful with these guys. You wanna make sure that you don't damage anything. If you puncture a hole here, you've gotta pull this whole unit out to access these lines. So I'm gonna just take these off, make sure to be very careful. There is a fitting on this side that's not particularly easy to get out. And so I'm just gonna disconnect it right here. And then you're gonna wanna start taking all of this apart. Take that guy loose. There's gonna be 2 spacers underneath there. Those guys pop out, and this is just gonna stay in there for now. I'm gonna release these bearing cap locks right there. Take those out. And now it's time to actually pull this cap out. You could release the tension on this diff. It's not strictly necessary, so I'm just gonna hit that with some 17s. That guy out. Now, before I get too far, it's worth noting these are, you can't screw up the side of these. However, in this case, because this is machined for the locker, I wouldn't be able to mix them up anyways. But if this was an open differential or if they were the same, I'd want to make sure to label them side to side. When I pull out these bearings, I want to make sure that everything stays where it should be. Otherwise, it can get pretty confusing. So now that I got these loose, you probably won't be able to just pull the thing out. I like to tap it with a hammer. Just a little tap here, a little tap there. And it's gonna walk itself right out. Be careful of these air lines. But here's that bearing cap is loose. Same thing over here. And that bearing cap is loose as well. Undo these screws. There you go. So you wanna make sure, here's that cap. You wanna keep that together. And then you wanna make sure that as you pull all of this out, it all stays together. So in order to get the whole carrier out, you're gonna wanna put a piece of wood back here against the housing. Just give it a good pop, and there you go. Everything kind of falls apart there. Gets a little crazy, but again, just take your time. Here's the bearing cap for the air locker side. We'll get to that in a minute. And then here's the bearing race and adjuster for the other side. So there's your locker assembly out. Now moving on to the pinion side of things, you can see here. So you can see here's your pinion gear, here's your air line that comes in, that goes to that diaphragm, and then this is actually that locker sensor. All it's doing is noticing when that disc is engaged or disengaged. It just knows when it's allowed to lock in. So there's that. Again, you don't need this, but you do need this, and so it's just easier to reuse this housing. And swap the gears over. So I'm gonna get to disassembling this. So we're gonna start on the back side here, and what we need to do is remove this nut, and we're gonna keep careful track of how everything is assembled going this direction into the diff. We're gonna have some things that come out this direction and some things that go out the other side. So this is a 30mm bolt. I'm gonna get that zipped off. Okay. There's that off. I'm gonna take a magnet in here and fish out this washer. You can see there's a washer right there. And then I need to remove this flange. I'm gonna use a 2-jaw puller and I'm gonna pull this off. All right, that comes right off. I'm gonna be using this on my new pinion, so I'm not worried about labeling anything right now. Got that guy pulled off. So I've got those, I know the order they go in, and now everything else is going to go out that direction. So the big thing is I need to separate this guy from the bearing that's in there. In order to do that, I'm going to use an air hammer. So I'm gonna place this up on its face, making sure that I'm not damaging that airline right there. So I've got it up on its face, make sure you're not damaging that airline. Got an air hammer in here. And slowly drive that guy out. There it is. Here's what that pinion is looking like coming out of there. So I still have one bearing race and an entire bearing. That's the bearing that I was pushing it out of that's gonna be attached right there to the shank of the pinion. And then you got some spacers here. Now I'm gonna mic these up later and see exactly what we're looking like for sizes, but this is going to set your pinion depth. And I have found that these tend to be pretty consistent throughout Mitsubishis. Depending on how much you know about diffs, you know that these can vary quite a bit. But there's really only 2 markings. This one is yellow right here, and this came out of the 4.3. And if we come over here and we look at this guy, this one is also yellow. There's a couple different variations, but that's gonna be the biggest one of there. That's gonna indicate the thickness of this, and it's only like 0.003 of an inch or something. Maybe not 0.003, 0.30 of an inch between the two. So the other thing I need to measure is gonna be this shim right here. So that sits right there on top of that. and it sits right here on top of that. There are a lot of fancy tools to set the exact pinion depth. I'm gonna figure out how different these are because in my experience, these housings are so similar that you can probably reuse those shims and it will set itself perfectly. Fingers crossed, let's find out. So rather than tackle the rear diff and setting all that up myself, I've done it before, but I just have so much more peace of mind leaving it to the professionals. They've got better tools. They can really measure things. I'm just really not set up for that, and I don't love the process. It stresses me out. So I'm going to bring the gears, that's the ring and the pinion, and that assembled locker housing to a professional and have them swap it over. They should have everything they need there. So now it's time to tackle the front, and the front is going to be a similar thing where I take it apart, I get the 4.9s out and I bring it to somebody, but I wanted to show you guys some of the big differences between these two gear sets. So here's the very greasy rear end out of a 2003 Montero Sport that had the 3.5 engine and all-wheel drive. Now there's going to be some differences that I want to point out between this and this guy right here. This is the one that came out of this 99. I don't know if it's a 99 or 98. This is the one that came out of this 99 Montero, and it's got a couple different things, as you can see right here, from the Montero Sport. So let's talk about this first. The first thing I want to point out is that this has a vacuum actuated differential. So what that means is when this wants to be in two-wheel drive, it pulls vacuum on this guy right here. It's got a diaphragm, it slides a pin over, and it disconnects the front end. That means that there's no power going to the differential from the transfer case, but there's also no attachment between the differential and the CV axles. Now the CV axles are still going to spin because they're attached to the hub of the vehicle, but they're not engaged at the diff. That allows all of the gears, everything in there to just sit still as you're moving. There's a little less wear, there's a little less rolling resistance, there's just less moving parts. The nice thing about this is that when you shift into four-wheel drive, it disconnects the vacuum from here and it engages the four-wheel drive system, and you don't have to touch anything outside the vehicle. So you can shift it on the fly. You can go from two to four-wheel drive in an instant. I really like that for snow. When you're driving these in the winter and you're in two-wheel drive because it's dry and then you encounter a patch of ice, you're able to slam it into four-wheel drive real quick and you're much safer for snowy conditions. This, however, is always in four-wheel drive. So theoretically, this is stronger and better for off-roading. There's less complication. You don't have all this stuff. So when I did the Montero, I actually switched to this housing. Instead of moving things around, I just put a locker in this housing and dropped it in the car. But for this build, I'm actually going to retain this housing. I may live to regret that. I may wish that I did this and stuck with this situation. But right now, I think this is the better option. I want to maintain that shift on the fly. And I know some people will say, you can still shift on the fly. It's just always going to be engaged. I would just rather do this. I'm not going to get into all the specifics of what modifications I could do, but you can add locking hubs, you can add auto hubs, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of things you can do to get around it. And for a lot of people, switching to this, that's the move. And I did that and it's fine. And I think it works great. However, this keeps it more stock, keeps it a little more simple as far as the daily operation of this, while sacrificing just a little bit of strength and adding a little bit of complexity to off-roading. I'm not scared of this. My Gen 3 has that system and it has not failed me yet. It's been okay. So I'm gonna actually move the gears, the pinion, and the ring from that housing into this housing. And I'm going to be adding a locker, but I'll get into that in a bit. The other thing you'll notice about this is the mounts are different. So this one's going to use a bushing like this versus these have a bushing that sits underneath them in the Montero Sport. I find these are way easier to work on, but also that just straight up won't fit. In the junkyard, I had to remove that side to get the CV axle out. It was kind of a whole mess. But that's something, if you wanted to swap this housing in, you would need to swap these arms onto here, which is not a big deal. I got to break the whole thing apart anyways. So we're going to start tackling this first. I'm going to get this disassembled and show you guys how to break down this axle so that I can get to those 4.9 gears. First step with getting this unit apart is to pop out this kind of intermediary shaft. So the way you get that out, you just put a pry bar in here and pry against it. You're just trying to pop it out, just like a CV shaft. It pops out right there. You're gonna have your bearing on this side, and this is actually where those nuts are gonna, or these bolts are gonna come out. Make sure to leave them in there, because when you put it back, if you assemble this whole thing and you forget, you're gonna be really annoyed with that. But we'll set that off to the side there, and then we can start tearing down this guy right here. We're gonna pull off this whole tube, but I believe you just need to remove these bolts right here. They're gonna be 17s. I'm gonna go ahead and pull this airline off for the breather. There we go, that's off. Then we'll get these zipped off and pull this whole thing apart. And there's that housing off. Super easy. Once you pop out that shaft, you just take these 4 bolts off right here, pry bar in here, boom, the whole thing comes out and you're looking at the diff. I pulled the cover and here's the 4.9 ring gear that we want. So we need to pull this whole carrier out. It's very different than the rear. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull these guys right here. This is a shimmed one, so it's gonna take quite a bit more force to pull this out. These are 17s right here, and then I'm gonna get my hammer in here and I'm gonna pop that guy out again. And I'll show you the shims once they're out. You're gonna wanna keep all of this as organized as you can, whether you're doing it yourself or you're bringing it to a shop. It's just helpful to have more shims just in case they don't have exactly what you're looking for. Doesn't mean you're gonna put the exact same shims back in, but it's good to have. So I'm gonna get these bolts buzzed off, pull this thing out, and we'll get to looking at the pinion. So there's the carrier out, just like I mentioned. You've got your bearing races, and then you've got these shims right here. Now, each of these shims have a certain thickness, and so when the diff shop is setting them up, they're going to shim it in or out depending on how they need to set the backlash. And so you've got one shim over here, and then there's going to be another one over here. Again, if you're doing this yourself, you got to learn all that stuff, and I'd recommend look up better videos than mine of how to set your pinion depth and your backlash and all of that. But these are just good to have, good to bring to the diff shop with you. That way they have extra rings. Now we need to go in there and get the pinion out. It's the almost exact same process. I'm gonna flip this thing on its head, make sure that I get some of this oil cleaned up, and we're gonna start working on that end. Okay, here's the E-locker ready to go. So I have the 4.9 ring gear transferred onto here. I've got bearings on there, and I've got, you know, the actual locker housing ready to go in. I've got all these bolts torqued down to 65 foot-pounds. It's much less than the rear. And this thing is ready to drop in the housing. Now, again, I'm gonna have my diff guy do the major work of setting the backlash and the pinion depth. But I want to get this in so that I can figure out where these go. So I'm just going to set it in there for now, figure out if it's something where he can set it without having these wires in the way. But I want to make sure all this works. That way, when I give it to him, he's not going to run into any issues. So I'm going to get it loaded up in there and see what it's looking like. So this is what I'm talking about with loading this thing up. Basically, I'm gonna have to send this off to my diff guy and he's gonna set up the rest. However, I need to know where this hole for this electrical connection goes. And this is very similar to the airline in the locker that we just looked at. It's gonna basically go in and out of this diff housing. And when you apply 12 volts to it, it's going to clamp the locker together. And when you release it, it's going to release it. Now, there's a couple things here. One is this locating tab. This prevents this whole mechanism from moving around. So you've got to use that, and it allows you to have 3 different positions. I've put mine here so that this wire is kind of poking out right at the very top of this. And I'm going to drill a hole right there for this little bung. So this guy actually gets threaded into the diff housing, and then you cinch this down and it'll prevent it from having any kind of leaks around this wiring, and they don't put the connector on there so that you can feed these through, which is awfully nice. So I'm gonna go ahead and get that threaded in. So I've got it right there. You got to make sure that it's in a place that's up high so that it's not down low and diff fluid's just going to leak out of it all the time. But you also want to make sure it's a place where it's not going to hit anything on the vehicle. And I've already checked. I should be good right there. So I'm going to get to drilling that hole and we'll get this thing threaded in. So there's the hole that I drilled and tapped. It's going to be an M10.5 hole, and they're going to use an M12 1.5 tap to go through it. And I actually ended up moving it up a little bit, you can see from right there, because this bracket would have been just a little too close where it was before. So I moved it so that it'll clear, and now I'm going to install the little bung. And if you can get this on as flat a piece as you can, that's ideal. It's a round diff, so there's not really a flat place. And so my recommendation is they do have an O-ring on here, but I'm going to throw a healthy amount of RTV on there just to make sure it's as sealed as possible. That way it's not going to leak. The other thing you're going to want to do, which I've already done, is clean up everything in here. You're going to have metal shavings and stuff in here. You do not want metal shavings anywhere inside of this diff. So give it a good clean, vacuum as much out as you can. You don't want them to get in here. And then once you got that, throw some RTV on this and install it, and then you're ready to send this thing off to your diff guy. Okay, it's a few days later. I have the diff back from the diff shop. It's all set up. The backlash is set correctly. Pinion depth set correctly. So it's time to get it slapped into this housing. And just like that, the rear end is in and tightened down. Now, I didn't film a lot of this because honestly, it's the exact same process as taking it apart. Few things to keep in mind though, you are gonna have to put a new thing of silicone in here. You have to pull the axle shafts out and get them lined up again. Make sure they go in, but it's very, very easy. If you've taken it apart, you can put it together, no problem. So I've got everything torqued down here. I've got this bolted to the axle housing, drive shafts on. I've got my air line attached for the locker, got the sensor attached right here, and I have the actual axle shafts bolted in, as well as the parking brake and the ABS sensor wires tucked back into where they're supposed to be. So there's the rear end dialed. This thing is now transferred over. The last thing I have to do is actually fill it with gear oil. And so I'll get in here and you're gonna do that on the backside right here. So I'll just pump some new gear oil in here. And if you're worried about this, so this says 4.3, you can actually get replacement stickers that say 4.9 if that's helpful for you to remember exactly what's going on in there. I don't really care. I might write 4.9 on there with Sharpie. But either way, that's the last thing, if anything, you need to do. I also cleaned this up right here. These brakes need to be replaced. It is on my list of maintenance. But it's good to spray all this down with brake clean because your axle housing is gonna be leaking some of that fluid. And after that, you're ready to move on to the front. So I have the front, it's ready to go. So let's head to the bench and I'll show you how to get that set up. Well, it's a little bit of a mess up here, but this is the front differential assembly. So I'm gonna be putting all this together, but I wanna start with this over here. So I've got the locker all set up in here. You can see where I ended up putting this guy. So it mounts up here so you can orient it. And then there's my tapped hole and these connectors, which I'll be hooking up later. And that's looking all good. So now it's time to slap this cover back on. I've already got this mount attached. This is the one. This is the whole carrier that came out of this car. So it's all gonna fit back in. I didn't have to swap anything over. And I'm going to be able to run this disconnect system, which I'll talk about in a second. But I'm gonna get this all lubed up with some RTV, get that suction on there, put the bolts in, and then we'll move on to this disconnect. Now that the cover's on, it's time to move on to this disconnected front end. So I figured this would be a good time to explain exactly what's going on here. Basically, instead of the CV shaft sliding all the way into this, you're going to have this little nub of the axle that goes into those splines. So that's gonna go in, it's gonna seat in the axle housing, and that's where it's going to live. Then you're gonna have this collar, and that collar is going to go over that. And it might be easier to assemble this whole thing at once, but it's gonna go just like that. It's gonna bolt up. And basically what this is doing is this is sliding in and out. And if you're familiar with a transfer case or even a transmission, you know kind of what this is like, where it's sliding this collar over these gears. So basically when vacuum is applied to this diaphragm, it pushes this whole assembly this way, which slides this collar over, which disengages it from this spline, which is where the CV shaft actually goes. So that CV shaft is actually mated to here, and this disconnect acts as an in-between. And when this slides over, it sits just on this gear. So the differential is allowed to spin, but it's not actually going to turn the tires. So that's really nice for quick shifts in and out of four-wheel drive. Like I said, it does add a little bit more of complexity and a failure point. But one thing I wanted to point out is this is always going to fail into four-wheel drive. It's one of the things I like about the Monteros because the vacuum is actually pushing this into a disengaged mode. So if you bang this on a rock or if you have trouble with your vacuum for any reason, it's actually going to pull it into four-wheel drive, which is much safer for off-roading. That means if this is going to fail, it's going to fail in the position you want it to be when you're on the trail. So with all of that explained, I'm going to get some RTV on here and we're going to slap this whole assembly together along with that. So here's that shaft going in. You're going to have to rotate it there. And you want to line it up with these dowel pins as well as get that center shaft in there. And you're going to have to tap it a little bit with a hammer. You can see I've got some RTV on there to seal it up real nice. And then once I tap that in, I'll get this bolted up. It's important that this goes on before this, because if you bolt this on, then you have no way to get the rest of the shaft on. So you have to bolt this whole thing together, and then I got to put in this sensor as well. Okay, we got a seal on that side, so we do not need to put RTV on that side. I'm gonna run these bolts through. Just get them kind of started. Finger tight. Then we'll zip those in and make sure that they're snug. Got that all buttoned up. And one of the other things that I forgot to mention you need to do is attach this actuator right here. So it's very simple to set up. You just gotta kind of wedge it in there. And then there's this little tiny pin that goes right in between, and that's gonna go on there. And then there's this collar that goes over the pin to hold it in place. Now, I showed you all that without putting this boot on because you gotta kind of stretch the boot back when you do this, and it's kind of an obnoxious process. But if you pull this back, you can kind of see, once you get this guy lined up, how it's gonna look. You gotta kind of scoot it past the point, drop this into its home, and it should seat and go all the way through, and then you slide that collar back over, and it's gonna allow it to flex just a little bit, but you want it to completely cover the top of that collar so that it's not gonna pop out. So the brake is gonna be on this backside, or I suppose it could be on the front side, but it's gonna hold that in. Then you slide this over, make sure that this boot is nice and free of tears. You don't want any debris getting there, obviously. Then you just take a couple 12mm bolts, or 12mm head bolts. You thread those in right here, and you're ready to go. As I mentioned, you're gonna wanna thread in this sensor. Be really careful with this. These wires up here tend to be pretty brittle. And I like to put a little bit of RTV on the threads. That way it seals up well. There is a washer in there as well, but I don't know. Better safe than sorry, I suppose. So we'll get this nice and screwed down. The orientation isn't super important with this. As you can see here, it's getting kind of snug. I'm gonna move it past there. But then where you're gonna lay it kind of is. So it's gotta come up here in the front, and then it's gonna attach to those brackets right there, and that's how it's gonna loop around to where it needs to plug in. Up here you can see there's another bracket that I cut, and then this guy is actually bolted to the frame of the vehicle where that mounts in. And lastly, you want to attach this vacuum line. This is where the routing goes. You got a bolt right there and a bolt right here so that it clears this actuator. And so you got these three guys poking out right here. I like to make sure these are nice and clean before I put it up in the vehicle. That way there's no grime or anything that's stuck in there. This is also a good time to just make sure all your nuts and bolts are looking good before you slap this thing together. Once you got the vacuum line and everything else attached, the only thing that's left is to attach this axle shaft, and you want to make sure that all of these bolts are going to be in there already. Otherwise, you can't get it in. You just thread this guy in just like you would a normal axle shaft. Get it nice and centered in, and you're probably going to have to punch it in with a hammer. Make sure it's lined up in that seal. Give it a good tap. Again, make sure all those bolts are sticking out, and this thing is ready to load into the car. Almost forgot one last step before you actually get this thing in the car, is to make sure that this plug and this wiring is all set. So you have to connect this plug end, which is really nice because it allows it to snake through there. And this is how I'm setting it up. It's very hard to see on here, but this is labeled 1 and this is labeled 2. And I've put the black wire into 1 and the the white wire into 2. And that's to match this on the plug. The plug here also has a 2 and a 1, and this is just black to black and red to white. I don't think that it matters. I think you can polarize this either way, but that's how I'm wiring it up. Then I'm gonna put some cloth tape, and for simplicity, I'm actually gonna route this right next to this breather. I figure if the breather's out of the way, I can leave that out of the way, and then it'll allow me to run this down with the rest of this harness and into this, and it tucks everything up out of the way and makes it look nice and clean. Okay, I can tell you right now, this is gonna suck. Not only to do, but also rough to film. So I'm gonna give this my best shot here of loading this thing up all by myself. Basically, you can do this on your back. You just put it up in there. But I'm gonna try to get it up, and it's gonna have to load like this, but it's also gonna have to go over here because there's a cross member here. So you just kind of gotta get it into place and send it. It's helpful to have a friend who can kind of help and guide you in this, but I think I've done this every time by myself, so I'm gonna give it a shot. you can loop those bushings over the sway bar, or sorry, not over the sway bar, over that front cross member or that steering crossover. That's super helpful. You want to get under here and lift up, push forward. Then you just gotta, come on. What are you stuck on? Oh. Okay. Ow. Whew. Okay. I don't know how that came out on video, but it's up there. Okay. Well, I managed to bump my head about 37 times doing that job. And now is for the really sketchy part. You gotta get these bolts started. So you gotta kind of wiggle and shimmy and shake it, but obviously you don't want it to drop out. It should be held in over here by that cross member. Oh yeah. Okay. Okay. Whoo, there's one. Let's go. Let's go. Oh, come on. Get a the bar. Oh, come on. Why are you so difficult? Okay, so that was a struggle, but we got it in. So you can see here, I've got one of those bolts up there, another one up there, and they're just loose. They're just hanging in there. But before I get everything hooked up back here with the cross member and this other differential mount, I want to connect these vacuum lines. And you can see this is why I like to disconnect them from the diff rather than from here, because when you disconnect them from the diff, then they all kind of just go back the way they're supposed to. So you can see like they all kind of just flow the direction that they originally did. So I'm gonna get these plugged in, but I'm also gonna show you guys, just in case yours got all screwy, I wanna show you where they go. So this guy right here coming off of the top of the actuator goes back to that line. This one right here, it's got a blue stripe on it. This one is going right back there. And then this one right below it is going to your diff breather. So that's gonna go right there on that side. And then this one goes to the vacuum canister that is actually located on the cross member, which is still over there. So this one won't get plugged in until later, but that's where all of those lines go. If you get confused, if you're wondering, if you get kind of turned around backwards, that's where they need to go. The other thing over here is going to be your electrical connection for that front diff sensor. It's gonna come right up here, and the other one that's disconnected is this ABS one, and I can't remember at this point where each of them go. It doesn't super matter. The thing that will matter though is that you wanna do gray to gray and black to black. The ABS sensor is going to be black. So get that wired in, and you can see I reattached that bolt back there and kind of fit it through the housing here. It's not super important that this stays intact. I think I cut that when I disconnected it. But now with all of that buttoned up, it's time to lift this up, get the cross member in, put these bolts in, and bolt in this diff mount, and then we are all buttoned up as far as getting it inside the car. We'll tighten up those front bolts, attach the drive shaft, and then it's on to each of the knuckles before this thing is back connected. Then all we have to do is fill up the diffs with fluid, wire up that locker, and we're good to go. All right, the cross member is in, all the connections are made up there. We are looking good to drop this thing down and start attaching the CV axles. Now the process to get those in is exactly the same as taking it out. The big thing right here is making sure that you can get enough threads on the ball joints to get those seated. So I'll try to film that and see if I can give you guys some tips and tricks to how to get all of that lined up and centered. But then it's as simple as just bolting everything back up, filling the diffs with fluid, and then taking it on a test drive. Okay, we're gonna start over here on the passenger side because it's the slightly more complicated side with that different hub. So you want to take your CV axle, should line up just fine, and if you've got all of these bolts in there, then you should be off to a good start. You just wanna line this guy up so that the bolts are going through. And then what I like to do is go ahead and grab a nut and a washer and just get one of them started. And one of the things that's gonna be really frustrating about this is as the bolts kind of sit back in this housing, they run into the bolts on the differential carrier, and so it makes turning them a pain. So you're gonna have to get a pry bar in there and move them around. So here's what I'm talking about is as this is kind of sitting back in here, it's gonna hit the bolt for the carrier. And so you've got to get a pry bar in here, or sometimes you can just wiggle it with your fingers and get them to pop out. Once they are all bolted up, they clear. But it's important to get these absolutely snug so that they don't back out and run into this, because otherwise you'll shear them off. So I'm gonna get a pry bar in here or a flathead screwdriver, work these out, get these started. You've got a nut and a lock washer. I'm gonna get all these attached, and then we'll attach the knuckle. All right, the next step is to load up the knuckle. Now remember, you wanna take this little spacer guy right here, this washer, and the grooves go towards the CV axle on this one. Get it up in there, get the CV shafts lined up, and then go ahead and slide the whole thing onto your lower ball joint. And while you're supporting it, go ahead and take your 24mm nut and start threading it on. And that should start to hold it in place. Now using a jack, in this case my transmission jack, I'm gonna support this knuckle and push it up, and you wanna be really mindful that it's not coming off the jack stand. And then I'm gonna pry down on this upper control arm right here until I get just a few threads showing on this ball joint, and then I'm gonna thread on this nut. If this proves to be too difficult, if you cannot get this to compress, you can release some tension on your torsion bar. That does mean that you're gonna have to reset your lift when you're done, but that can be really helpful to relieve some of this so that it comes up more easily. It's also way safer if you need to do that. Go ahead and take care of that, and then get this attached, and then readjust your torsion bar once you're done. Once this upper ball joint is attached, I like to attach this guy right here for the tie rod. Then I like to get all of these snug, this upper, lower, and the tie rod, and put fresh cotter pins in them. After you've got a cotter pin in all of those, make sure to reattach your ABS line following the factory mounting spots, and then connect this down where we've mounted everything else for the differential, and make sure you plug in this guy to the black sensor wire. We want to come over here and reinstall the snap ring that goes on the snout of the CV shaft. Don't forget that little spacer there. Make sure this locks into the grooves, and attach the dust cap. Last but certainly not least, you want to attach any brake components that might have fallen off during disassembly. In this case, I lost both pads, and this would be a great time to put in new pads, but I will be doing a full brake service and upgrade later. So I'm just gonna slap these guys in for now. Come down and reconnect your caliper. Grease up your slide pins and put them in. The one with the rubber front goes in the bottom. Okay, all wrapped up on this side, got the brake on, everything is attached, including that ABS sensor. So now it's time to move on to the driver's side and get that wrapped up as well. Well, we've got the rear end, we've got the rear axle bolted up, we've got the front all assembled, which means it's time to put fluids in this thing and take it for a test drive. Now, we still need to wire up the locker, but before we do that, I do want to take it on a test drive and make sure everything's playing nice. There's no point in getting this all finalized if it's got a weird sound or a clunk or this needs to come out. God forbid it needs to come out. So I've got this cracked and I've got the one in the back cracked. I'm gonna fill these up with gear oil. We're gonna drop it down, put tires on it, and take it on a test drive. All right, this thing is back on the ground, and now it's time to take it on a test drive and see how these gears feel. All right, so the first test, I'm just gonna putz around here in this parking lot. I want to engage four-wheel drive. I want to just listen for any weird clunks or clanks. So I'm gonna drive it around a little bit in two-wheel drive, pop it into four-wheel drive, and wait for these lights to settle out. And that's what you're looking for right there. All of the wheels are locked up, so that sensor in the front is working. I can confirm the front wheels are driving. I have tried the rear locker. It's working. Everything is going smooth. Time to take it out on the road. So I'm cruising on the road, I'm going 45 miles an hour, and the speedometer is actually accurate now. Because of the way the gear ratios work, when you go to 35s and you switch to 4.9s, it brings it back to stock. So that's amazing. That means my mileage counter is gonna be correct. That means that my speedometer is gonna be correct. And so far, so good. I mean, this thing is driving smooth, it feels sporty. And right now I'm listening for any kind of weird grinding or binding, either when I go around sharp turns or as I'm accelerating and decelerating. I wanna know if what the diff's doing. I'm also gonna drive around in 4-wheel drive or all-wheel drive here in a little bit, but I wanna just give the rear a chance to settle in. Chances are things need to get moving again, things need to get used to each other again. Those gears are in different spots than they used to be, but it should be pretty smooth the whole way. You shouldn't have a whole lot of break-in period, and there shouldn't be that much wear on the gears because they are used. So I'm gonna continue this test drive and hopefully everything keeps going smoothly. Okay, now I've got it in all-wheel drive and the sensor's still trying to figure itself out. But right now, I'm just listening for any kind of weird grinding or clicking or binding, any strong senses of resistance as I apply the gas or as I decelerate. And so far, so good. I mean, I'm moving around. I got a roundabout up here. I want to see how it does in that. I probably go all the way around the roundabout just to see how it does when I turn. That's when the axle is going to be working the hardest because you got the open differential is going to be working in there. And so I want to see, is it going to make any sound? Is it going to give me any grief? It's a pretty nerve-wracking process. After all the work, after all the money we spent, you really want something like this to work. Oh boy, Subaru, you're taking your time. Oh, they're going around with me. Let's go. Okay. So far, sounds great. No weird hesitation, no binding, no clicking, no grinding. Wow. It pays to have a good diff guy who sets up your diffs well. I'm so glad I did that. There's that sensor figuring itself out. So I'm in all-wheel drive, on the fly, feeling good, giving it some gas. Yeah, this thing's feeling solid. So now with the differentials in the car, the very last step is to wire up the front locker, which because it's an E-locker, is pretty easy, and it's made even easier with this aux beam switch panel. So like I said, this is my buy once, cry once, do it exactly as I want to rig, and I knew that I wanted the E-locker instead of an air locker, and I knew that I wanted this aux beam switch panel. I had this in the other one. I've had this in a lot of different cars. I love this thing. It makes it so much easier. I'll show you under the hood exactly how I wired it up for this locker, but it makes it so easy to just have it right here. And for the Gen 2.5 and the Gen 2, this is where I wanted it, because when you shift this transfer case lever all the way forward, if you had something right here, this lever actually blocks it. So it's actually pretty inconvenient to get to the rear diff lock because this transfer case lever is pretty far forward. But then when you're driving, this lever for the transmission is back. So it actually exposes this to be just within arm's reach. You can hit all this stuff, and you can see here, I've got it set up. I've got some bumper lights on there right now. I'm working on a few other things that I'm gonna attach, but right now the front locker is the main thing. So let me show you what that looks like under the hood. So right now I've got this run a little crudely because I'm going to come in and tidy it up, but I wanted to show you guys exactly what I've got going on here. This is my main power source for the aux beam. It's on this little breaker right here. So if it does trip it, you can just flip that back, and then that's screwed into the fuse box. So it's easy to move on and off. Ran that wire across here. Like I said, I'm going to put a wire loom on it. I'm going to tape it or zip tie it out of the way, but I wanted to show you guys what it looks like. And then it goes right here. My previous mount was over there. I can't do that because of that canister. This is also just a way better spot for it. Way better access to this panel. So you can see all the wires coming in there, and then it's got the brake lines here that you have to move out of the way if you're gonna pull it off. So once you get that thing off, there's your spare fuses, fuse puller, and this you can see all the wiring. So this is all the things you can tap into. I've only got really 3 things tapped into it right now, but this is the locker right here. And so you can just see it's 2 wires, and I've just run power and ground, and that's all that it takes to actuate that thing to lock it into place, and it works perfectly. So it's super nice to just wire it in here, plug it up into this. I don't have to run anything else into the cab. All the other wires are already run underneath this through the patch in the firewall. So it's really simple. You can just plug it in here and then you hit a button on the inside and it turns it on. And this thing's working phenomenally. So I'm super pleased with where this ended up. I'm really, really happy I went with an E-locker. There's some debate online whether you go with E or air. And for me, this is so much more simple and it works just as well, in my opinion, as an air locker. So I have had this thing out. Spoiler alert, I've been doing some work. You can see there's a lot more going on. I've had this thing out on a trip and that thing is working phenomenally. So I'm very pleased with that, very pleased with the aux beam stuff, very pleased with the E-locker. I think it was the right decision. This whole setup is working out really well. So we got this thing dialed in. I've got the locker hooked up. I've got the gears in. I've got them broken in. I've been on the road with them for a little while. And the last thing I want to talk about is the difference for cruising on the road. Obviously, it's going to make a little bit of a difference off-road. That's going to be harder to explain by the numbers. But what does make a huge difference is my gear ratio at cruising and highway speeds. So what has actually happened is the gear ratio is now at the same mechanical advantage. It's at the same ratio with the 35s as it was on the stock tires, the 31-inch tires, and the 4.3 gears. So there's a lot of math involved with that, but basically the car is moving at the same rate. The RPMs are moving at the same rate that they would have been from the factory, but it's turning bigger tires. So let me go to the whiteboard and show you exactly what that looks like as far as my RPM at different speeds with and without the 4.9 gears. All right, and here's those numbers. So what I've done here is this is the 4.3 gears versus the 4.9 gears, and I did tests at 65, 75, and 80 miles an hour, and I measured the RPM. So over here, we see on the 4.3 gears, that's the stock gearing with the 35-inch tires, we were at 2,100 RPM at 65, 2,500 RPM at 75, and 2,700 RPM at 80, which is my legal speed limit here in Montana. Now, when we went to 4.9, the RPMs went up. So instead of being at 2,100, we were at 2,500 at 65, 2,500 turned into 2,950 at 75, so that's 450 RPMs higher. And then at 80, we were up at 3,050 RPMs over the 2,700 RPMs. So you can see here, that's an increase of 400 at 65, 450 at 75, and 350 at 80. Now, those ratios might seem a little strange if you're not used to seeing the difference in the gears at the final drive. You might think higher RPM, isn't that worse for the motor? And actually what it does is it restores the factory ratio. So when this was on 31s, when it came from the factory, this is what it wanted to run. It wanted to be in this range for this mile an hour. But when I went to the 35s, this dropped, and therefore this actually compensates. So this, if you have a stock Gen 2 or Gen 2.5 in this case, this should be the ratios that you're running if you have stock gearing and stock tires. And what this actually means is it feels better on the road, it gets better gas mileage, and it's better for the transmission and motor as they're pushing the bigger tires. So this is an optimal gear ratio, and I'm really pleased with it. So it feels great at 80 miles an hour, even fully loaded. It is happy to cruise there, and I'm getting about 16 to 17 miles per gallon, which is really, really good for me. It's actually better than my Gen 3. It's way better than the Montero for some reason, probably because it's not sitting quite as tall and that engine's just a little more efficient. But either way, I'm super pleased with it. Thank you guys so much for watching this. This has been a long video. This was a big task. I am so thankful it's over. Really, really pleased with the locker. So pleased with the gears. This is a huge step in the right direction for this build. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.